I will follow the order that has been given to us. So I will request morning or good night to wherever you are. I don't know. It's very difficult actually to figure out where we are and in which time zones. Doesn't matter. We are going to discuss a book which has come out in 2022, which is Imprints of Populist Time, authored by Professor Ranabir Samaddar. I had the opportunity of reading the book, although time was very short, so I had to read it rapidly. I will sort of, as I was reading the book, I was trying to figure out what are the departures from the commonplace literature on populism that Professor Samaddar has made. And I will take 2 or 3 of your minutes to sort of set the ball rolling. The ground rules will be like that. I will request Professor Samaddar to say a few words about the making of the book, not so much on the book, because it's understood that panelists have read the book. So he will say a few words about the making of the book, the background to the book, and then he will take about 10 minutes or something like that. And then I will request Professor Samita Sen and Professor Sandro Mezzadra to reflect on the book. And each one of you will take 12 to 15 minutes. I hope that will be okay. Dr. Rajarshi Dasgupta is absent. So I will open it to the floor then. We'll collect some of the comments and questions if there are any. And then I will request again Ranabir to sort of wrap it up and we will end there. So we begin with 2 or 3 departures, which I think this book has made in our understanding of populism. I'm referring to the first departure. While people are central to democracy, democracy per se has no theory of the people. It takes people as a pre-given entity or a historical body waiting to be represented, waiting to represent itself within the framework of democracy. Habermas, however, argues that the people comes into being through their common allegiance to a set of universal rules. But this hardly explains the historically specific and contingent nature of the given body of people in terms of their variation across space and time. So the historicity of the people is absent, which is a point which has come out very eloquently in the book. Samaddar brings in populism to show how it constitutes people, how people comes into being as a body through policies, which we describe as populist policies, schemes, welfare measures, and by bending and wherever necessary by breaking laws. So I think that this is the departure 1 of the book. And then I move over to departure 2, which is complementary to the first point. Democracy hardly accounts for the history of the political. I think that what he hasn't done in chapter 1 or introduction is to allude to the distinction between politics and the political, which is characteristic of French political theory. But I guess that much of what he writes is informed by the theoretical distinction which is made between politics and the political. The book addresses the political, the commonplace literature addresses the political either by way of situating it within the framework of strategic politics. I bodily lifted from one of the books which has been circulating in Indian academics for long, which I think is following the tradition of American sociology, with the rider that co-option and strategic politics continuously extends democracy and its horizon with increasingly greater radical effects, radical within quotes, or by way of investing democracy with a revolutionary character. Samaddar finds populism as a key bridging point between politics and the political, alluding perhaps to the distinction that French theorists make. While politics refers to a spectrum of activities that are mediated through institutions, directly or indirectly contributing to decision-making, populism is situated, and then I quote, beyond the received history of institutions, unquote. So wherever it occurs, it has a destabilizing effect on the institutions. That's what the book argues. And I think that that's departure two. The third departure to my mind is this. Unlike most of the theorists of populism, Samaddar shows how populism is an anathema to economic rationality. Abhijit Binayak Banerjee and Esther Duflo's Nobel Prize-winning book, Poor Economics, on the other hand, argues that economic behavior of the poor, and both of them were referring to the patently economic term poor rather than the subaltern, which is politically charged. And we will do well to remind us of the distinction between the poor and the subalterns, contrary to what textbook economists would have us believe. Now, this is a book which is also as much about the economic rationality of the poor. And it's only that the way, for instance, the discipline of economics has grown, it has failed in understanding the economic rationality of the poor or endowing the poor with the kind of rationality that is characteristic of dominant economic theory. So it is, and that's the reason why economics of poverty has always been poor economics. That's what the book argues. So I think that this book, Samaddar's book, is contraposed to the argument that Abhijit Binayak Banerjee and Esther Duflo have provided. So these, to my mind, are the three major departures that the book has made. So I don't want to anticipate the course of discussion, and please don't feel constrained by the comments which I have offered at the very outset. So it's over to Professor Samaddar, and he will reflect on the making of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. I am happy and grateful that Samita, Sandro, two dear friends of mine and other, very dear friends, they have joined this discussion. Thanks, Samir, for your introductory comments. Here the internet connection is not very stable, so at any moment it may go off, and if it goes off, I will try to reconnect, but don't wait, please, begin the discussion or carry on the discussion. Just to make few remarks on the making of the book. One is that I really did not have so much of French theory in mind, and nor I am literate very much about it. So you have to believe me that I did not have all those in mind. I have fragmentary readings. Of course, I learn whatever I can. But when I was writing the book, it was more a response to the left politics in India, as well as several other, globally. There is a small chapter on global populisms, and in fact, I should have written more on that. So this is much more a political response, and it may have been informed by my own eclectic, training. So do not you know, give me so much credit for that. The one thing that I have in mind, and I will tell you of my ambivalence about this book, and the reason for this is that when I compare it with my first book in a way, which led to the second passive revolution in West Bengal. So I see the difference between the two, and I doubt that whether this book will make, as much impact on the market as the first one did. And I also remember the public discussion on the book where Shobhanda, my dear friend Partho, they all commented, and the severe beatings that I received there. I will make one or two remarks on that, which will immediately, tell you why I'm ambivalent. One is that there was one criticism, if you remember, of both Shobhanda and Partho in their, of course, different ways. Also, as you know, Professor Amit Bhaduri was there. That this was under-theorized. Someone reflected that, can I use the term passive revolution only in the context of West Bengal? Someone questioned, what did passive revolution end after 2011? So in a way, I smiled within myself, chuckled also, because it seemed to me a much more, I shouldn't use the word, a much more, how would I put it, much more academic understanding of the term, and too much bound by the literature, flowing from Gramsci and others. And I would not recall the response that I gave. I have that in mind. But nonetheless, finally, I was happy because each year I found that the book was making good progress in the market, and notwithstanding scholars' criticisms, it had hit the, the point. Would this be able to do? And the reason why I'm ambivalent is that in the case of the passive revolution in West Bengal, this was, in short, I was told that it was under-theorized. And Samir perhaps alludes to that. He thinks that this is theorized probably over or to the correct extent. And therein is my ambivalence. Because if you see the history of populism, populism is, I would still argue, notwithstanding Laclau's best of his efforts and others, I still think that populism is more a name, a sign given to an ensemble of popular political practices which cannot be completely theorized. And therefore, if the publisher had listened to my suggestion, Sage has listened, and if Orion Black Swan had agreed to my original proposal of following the passive revolution book model, then this would have, perhaps it would make greater impact on the market, on the reader, etc. So the question is that writing in a quasi-theoretical way a book on populism is probably a self-defeating exercise, because you cannot put in a theoretical garb something that is deeply practical and experiential. And populism is something, a name which we have given to certain political practices, which make people, but which originate from the idea that people have been transformed into population. And it is the population who believes, who realizes that they are not the true denizens of democracy, that they have to attain their position in politics, etc. And therefore, the range of practices that they follow. So this is something that is, this is one of the reasons why I'm ambivalent, that whether this was the correct way to put it. If it does well in the market, I'm happy. If it does not, I would not put it to the argument, but I would blame it to the, to the structure of the book. And so all the blame would go to the publisher, at least in my mind. The second thing is, again, a self-defeating enterprise in terms of commentary also, which is that, can you judge populism through the optics of representative mechanisms? And most of the time, we make our judgments, we pass our judgments on populist practices through our usual political optics, which is the optics of representative democracy, including organized movement like trade unions, etc. Can you judge through trade union, let us say, what the workers did in the early part of the 19th century? Can you judge through organized politics of today, let us say, what the subalterns did in the 17th century, let's say something on which Christopher Hill writes, the world turned upside down, etc. Can you judge the periodic switch from the idea of the people and population, or what is popular and what is populist? Can you draw a permanent line? Can you draw a clear line and say, this is popular and this is not popular, or this is populist? So I think this is where, the way in which we write the history of politics is a way that cannot capture the ensemble of practices and experiences to which we have given the term populism. So this is something that was in my mind. I may have opted for a wrong structure in writing the book. I'm not very sure, but if it turns out to be right, I'll be happiest. But if it is not, I shall understand. But something this is. The third is something where I shall certainly, take Samir's point. When I was commenting on what was happening in West Bengal from 2011 onwards, because I was not covering, except in terms of introductory chapters, what had happened in India, or for that matter, pre-partition Bengal. I allude to Maulana Bhasani, Fazlul Haq. I allude to agrarian populism. I allude to farmers' populist movement led by Sharad Joshi or Mahendra Tikait, etc., other populist movements. But something that I must confess impacted me when I reread. And initially, I had not read it very closely, Foucault's Punitive Society. Not because, things were there that I did not know, history of the Quakers or history of the other sects that Foucault writes. But I was searching for a question, searching for a reply, or let us say searching for some light on the question, which is namely this, that Marx writes this, entire concluding part of at least the published version of the volume 1 of Capital. And Marx says that from, his writings from the Factory Acts, etc., he in fact comments somewhere that I have devoted my life, I have spilled my blood into writing the blood, how blood of the workers were channelized into making of Capital, something of that sort remark. But in those, immortal chapters, it is the process of a historical past, maybe it is present, I forget that debate for a moment, but what was politics like? So that is where, one has to reread the political accounts of not only Christopher, but from that sense, I feel that Foucault's Punitive Society is a brilliant light on that question. What happens to people? What happens to society when the society seems to be up for loot? People are now being remodeled, redesigned as producers of wage labor. And in those 2 centuries, what happened to politics of the people? What happened to illegal politics? And this term, therefore, popular illegalism, on which Foucault spends quite a number of pages in that book. I think that we have not done enough justice to the book. Probably Foucault himself did not do enough justice to the book. I have read some of the notes of the study circles on that book. There is this journal on Foucault studies, where again, I have read some of the accounts, but I think my judgment is that the book should not be seen as a preparation to discipline and punish, but it stands, those lectures are one of his finest lectures. They stand on their own. My last comment on the book is that I was driven, and you will see in the book, I was driven by this idea, by this question: why is it that at certain points of time, this word populism gains infamy in as much as it gains currency? Does it speak of a conjuncture? Does it speak of a crisis? I wouldn't dwell on that. I think the book tells quite a lot on that. But I do not know whether the reviewers will take note of that. I have seen only one kind of bit of, I wouldn't know, somewhere an idiosyncratic review. I mean, not idiosyncratic, but goes off in a different direction. But what is it? Or what is the circumstances? What is precisely those conjunctural times when populism emerges? So I am right now in Marseille, and as you know, whole France is echoing and re-echoing with the working class revolt of over pension reform. And it is not simply a working class revolt. It seems the entire society has joined in. But at the same time, this society has forgotten that only 4 years back, an immediate, almost similar kind of militant uprising shook Paris by the name of Yellow Vest uprising. What makes the society accept this, and reject that from the civilized, organized left point of view? What is therefore the conjuncture? So I will stop here, and I think these were, you know, the thoughts in my mind when I was writing. Thank you, Shomit.
Thank you very much, Ranabir. I think that these comments are very helpful in the sense in unlocking many of the arguments. And this sets the tone of our discussion today. So I will now request Professor Samita Sen to reflect on the book.
Thank you. Yeah, let me start by drawing out a little bit more from what both Samir and Ranabir have already said about the book, and say that you can cut it many ways. It's a very complex book. The arguments are interconnected. Some arguments are made early in the book and picked up later. So there are many ways you can describe the book. I take 4 major strands to flag today. In the book, and this is that his approach to populism is historical as well as theoretical. So a lot of the time he is trying to understand populism in a particular historical context, connecting it to broader movements, both historically and in contemporary times with other contexts. So in that sense, I think the term he uses and populism in neoliberal times that connect the experience, say, of West Bengal within India. So there's a state context, a national context within a global context. So there are many spatial territorial layers in that book, which, are interesting to tease out. The second, I would say, is a very strong empirical strand where he's looking at the experience of the Trinamool Congress government in West Bengal. He is starting from 2011, though that is not so much in his focus. His focus is more on elections of 2014, 16, 19, and 21. And because the empirical discussion in the book is structured a great deal around these elections, the narrative, I would say, empiric rather than empirical, the narrative structure is focused very much around these elections. It connects to the question that Ranabir flagged, which is the relationship between populism and representation. I will come to that in a minute. The third, of course, is another it's not present throughout the book so much, but there is an underlying strand, and then is picked up in one chapter, which is migration and citizenship. And this also, again, obviously links closely to questions of representation. And this also I will pick up very briefly for discussion. The fourth to my mind strand is what he picks up actually in the afterword, which is in the context of the pandemic. And he ends with a point that he sees biopolitics from below as an important theme of politics in our times. And that, I think, is actually a thread one can see running through the book, though it is not always articulated as such. So let me then pick up the two issues that I want to very briefly discuss in the 12 to 15 minutes given to me. The first is that the question of representation. And since I'm sitting in the UK, thinking about reading the book and thinking about Ranabir Samadar's arguments, I'm reminded very much of the Canavan book on Blair and Tony Blair's populism. And of course, a lot of this Anglo-American literature on populism addresses this empty place of power question and the nature of state, and how, and Canavan's argument, of course, is that the people are brought back into the understanding of the state, into the processes of the state. So that argument seems to me to have a strong resonance with Ranabir Samadar's reading of the Mamata Banerjee government in West Bengal. Now, of course, representation is at the heart of the structure of the book. And I would think the way he is putting out the argument. And the context, predictably, of course, Ranabir doesn't pick it out, but I see gender. I see a strong gender current because the story of populism begins with Indira Gandhi. And in Ranabir Samadar's book, though there are other state governments, other formations in which populism is taking place, the two examples he uses at some length is apart from Mamata Banerjee, Jayalalitha. So what is it about the polity where women leaders seem to be, from the evidence given to us, more prone to populism? The context seems to be Jafar Lowe's argument that it's the 1980s turning point in Indian politics, caste, reservation, caste, and democratization. That seems to me the background. In the 1980s, in Indira Gandhi, in the late 70s, in Indira Gandhi's populism, of course, there was never any articulation of gender. Indira Gandhi, though despite this India is Indira and all that statement, Goddess Durga, Indira never articulated a women's issue and never approached women as a constituency. In India, generally, did not have women as a vote bank at a time when in many other countries, women were emerging as specific constituencies or interest groups. So in a way, it is Mamata Banerjee, Jayalalitha to some extent maybe, but Mamata Banerjee really who has targeted women as a constituency at a time when one could argue in national politics also you are seeing women's electoral power because of the triple talaq, the way BJP used the triple talaq legislation. But that is a one-off, and that is a trade-off in terms of gender and community. It is Mamata who has more or less consistently, and here the question of representational politics, Ranabir connects theoretically with a set of terms, which I will come to a little later, which is rights, protection, welfare. And so Mamata Banerjee's mode of populism is very connected to welfare, and the way she does welfare is through governmental schemes, which is very different from the left front government. And so if we look at her schemes, then it's amazing how many of them are targeted to women. And it is also amazing that throughout the left front government, one issue on which every other state had started schemes, including a very successful scheme in Bihar, West Bengal didn't, which is child marriage. There was nothing in West Bengal, no governmental intervention in child marriage until Mamata floated Konyashri, which became a very successful scheme, won loads of awards here and there. She followed it up with Ruposhri, and then there is the very, very successful Lokhi Bhandar scheme. So I see a way in which, but it is also interesting that in 2011, before she came to power, in that very famous interview she gave to, I forget what it was then, Star Anuntu, I think, Shumande. She said actually that I'm not a woman. And I'm not seeking women as a to her. She said, I am not addressing women. And Bhaira, my brothers, are an important, are the basis on which I do politics. Nevertheless, in stealth almost, so she doesn't say this, she denies it, but almost by stealth, she has built up a women's constituency. And many people argue, I don't know, this is my question to Ranabir, to what extent is gender important? So normally in populism, one does not see these categories because in populism, you don't dissect the people, you don't divide the people. But to what extent Mamata's, the tension between her rhetoric and her strategy, to what extent is she using gender? How would Ranabir respond to this set of issues? And they connect. I thought I really enjoyed the passage in the subsection in the book, page 95, Commissar and the Poet. The exchange between Shankha Ghosh and Anubrata Mondal, which I didn't know of before. That theme which is the chapter, which is the question of civility, I think also connects very well with the question of gender, because many of the examples that Ranabir provides in that chapter are really abuses based on sexuality and gender. So my second point, and I will come to my second point through an argument Ranabir makes in one of his chapters, which is why migration is important to this question. And he argues that migration is important to this question because I'm running out of time, so I'll be a little telegraphic at this point.
Samita, you don't have to feel constrained. You can actually overshoot the time because the third speaker is absent.
Okay. So he makes the point that why is migration important to the story? Because it unsettles the border between family and state. And of course, this is why people who work on gender are attracted to the question of migration, because migration opens up the space of the family in a way which otherwise the family is not usually open to public documentation, forget anything else. So through this, I am coming to the question Ranabir poses on page 57, which is what is the relationship between populism, and this also he said repeatedly in his presentation, what is the relationship of populism with a democratic crisis, which he says is also a social crisis. And here, I think the framing of his argument is on one side a lexicon of resistance, where he's looking at 4 terms, I think, multitude, class, people, and population, and a lexicon of the state, which is rights, protection, and welfare. And it is the relationship between these, the lexicon of resistance and the lexicon of state. I think it is within the interstices of these 7 terms, really, that his argument about populism is constructed. So one aspect of this is, of course, the intense struggle for citizenship, which he argues is shaped by the aftermath of partition, and which frames the question of statelessness, gaining incredible urgency at a time when the central government has adopted extremely aggressive policies as represented by CAA and NRC. Now, the implication of this, and I just wanted, again, Ranabir's response to this. We know partition literature dwells at length on the difference between partition in the East and the West. In the West, the Punjab partition was quick, swift. It was also led to a hard border. So whatever migration, exchange of population happened within a few months. And then there has been some amount of population exchange, but nothing of great volume. Whereas the East retained a porous border. And what we forget often, and the partition literature does not highlight, it's only in very, very recently in the last 5 years that this has come into our attention, is that this is not only Bengal, this is also Assam. So both Assam and Bengal has had a very porous border, and this has meant a continuous migration on both directions. So what does this then, these 2 very different kinds of borders that partition produced have to do with the tension between politics at the center and politics in West Bengal, and its implications for questions of citizenship. And I would relate that to the reflections Ranabir makes in page 85 to some extent, but in and around that kind of place in the book, on the nature of electoral power itself. And what exactly, Shomir also referred to this, the relation, he kind of makes the argument. Shomir was saying it's politics and the political. Ranabir also argues that this is what connects politics and the social. That I think is a very important strand in the book, which also connects us to development. I was thinking I would say a few words about development, but Shomir has already flagged those issues, so I will desist and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samita, for your set of excellent comments. So it's over to Sandro. Sandro, the third speaker is absent, so you can take a little more time.
Okay, thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to participate in this kind of discussions in events organized by CRG. And needless to say, it is always a great pleasure for me to discuss with Ranabir. I will start with a quote from the first chapter of the book, where Ranabir writes that left-wing populist upsurge today is all about the class question of our time. End of quote. Indeed, the question at stake in this book, even beyond populism, is the search for a new class politics, for a new political subject capable to open new avenues of democratic and socialist transformation in what Ranabir calls the current global time of chaos. Let me say that this is what I deeply share with Ranabir. This is the reason why I thank him for this political commitment, for this political militancy, and for his impressive academic work. This is also the reason why I thank him for writing this book. For me, reading from afar, so to say, the most compelling and fascinating aspect of Imprints of the Populist Time is the discussion of Mamata Banerjee's party and government in West Bengal. And as Ranabir was saying before, Imprints of the Populist Time is a kind of follow-up of a previous book, Passive Revolution in West Bengal, which in a way, at least in my reading, described the formation and the eventual electoral defeat of the left front in West Bengal in 2011. I have kind of followed the controversies that Ranabir was discussing before, but I repeat, I read those books from afar, and reading Passive Revolution in West Bengal and Imprints of the Populist Time together allow me to get a hint of the materiality of politics in West Bengal, of the mutations and dissolution of a specific kind of class politics that led to the emergence of populism. One of the most original contributions to the ongoing debate on populism is provided by Ranabir in this book in chapter 7, where kind of tackles the question of the populist economics, which is a kind of question that is not often discussed in the literature on populism, as well in the literature on neoliberalism. Populist economics is, Ranabir explains, an economics grounded on the idea of protection and rehearsing the vexed question of economic justice. He doesn't speak much of capital in that chapter. So let me say that I have been reminding while reading the book of a notion that Partha Chatterjee introduces in his recent book on populism, I Am the People 2020. I'm thinking of the notion of a tactically extended state that Partha opposes to what he calls the integral state. There would be, of course, much to say about these two categories. But what interests me now is that Partha describes an entirely new set of techniques that have arisen in post-colonial countries to tactically extend the reach of the state to target population groups that were on the margins of what he calls the integral state. He says that by doing that, the state ensured the conditions of legitimacy for the dominance of capital. More from Ranabir, between an extension of the state, which allows to provide welfare services to marginal population groups, and the reproduction of the dominance of capital. But anyway, let me repeat that the chapters of the book on West Bengal are really impressive, and I have learned a lot, not only on the specific situation of West Bengal, but also more generally on the notion of populism, reading those chapters. When Ranabir approaches the question of global populism, most notably in the third part of the book, well, things become a bit more complicated for me, and I am a bit more cautious and sometimes even skeptical. One of the problems is, of course, the well-known fact that populism is a kind of amorphous concept, one that is difficult to define. And moreover, as it happens with neoliberalism, it is a concept used much more by its critics than by actors who positively identify with populism. Ranabir is very much aware of this kind of predicament, he refuses to speak of populism in terms of an ideology or even a reason, to put it with Ernesto Laclau. Populism, Ranabir writes, can only be described as an ensemble of political and economic practices. And this is a very important point in his book. I will return to it in a moment. Anyway, fair enough. An ensemble of political and economic practices. But we need a political parameter, criterion that allows us to understand, to evaluate, and also to differentiate those practices. We are confronted here with another vexed question, which means the difference between left and right populism. With respect to this question, my impression is that there is a kind of oscillation in Ranabir's book. There are pages in which readers have the sense that only left populism is real populism. But then in chapter 10 and in other parts of the book, we read that the whole discussion on the distinction between left and right populism is, I quote, largely fruitless. Okay. And this is because, this is at least my reading, of course, populism builds for Ranabir today a kind of material background against which what he calls the return of class and class struggle is played out. So let me say that I find this angle definitely very interesting. And I will come back to it in a moment. But for now, let me say that for me, living in a country like Italy, which is governed by a coalition of parties in which far-right populism figures prominently, the distinction between right and left populism is not completely ruled out. But let me add something. Let me point to a common link between right and left populism that at least in Europe and in the US is quite important today. I would have a lot to say, as Ranabir knows, about Latin America as well, but I leave it first out for want of time. Who is afraid of migrants in Bengal? Asks Ranabir in a chapter of his book on passive revolution. Well, in Europe and also in the US, the answer is quite easy, although it may sound uncanny in our present discussion. The populists are afraid of the migrants, no matter whether from the right or from the left. Allow me to focus very quickly on left populism in Europe. What people like Sarah Wagenknecht, for instance, in Germany stresses is that the left, with its emphasis on civil rights, on feminism, on women, on sexual minorities, and on migrants, has betrayed the autochthonous working class, the national working class, which is the very bulk of the people. So in doing that, left populism proposes the image of a homogeneous political subject, nationally homogeneous political subject, that is not at all up to the contemporary challenges of class struggle and politics. So among the instances of populist politics that Ranabir discusses in the book and that Ranabir mentioned before are the yellow vests in France. But the yellow vest explicitly took the form of a class movement. And moreover, in order to make sense of the yellow vest, we have to locate that movement within at least a decade of social mobilization and class struggle in France that continues to our days, as Ranabir was mentioning before. So the yellow vest took the form of a class movement, and this happened among many other reasons that I would be happy to discuss later, against the background of the formation of another movement, the Gilet Noir, the Black Vest, a movement of illegalized migrants that started in November 2018 in the region of Paris. Even beyond the actual mass dimension of the Black Vest, this movement was crucially important precisely because it created a political scene within which racism was contested in the panoply of assemblies that constituted the political form of the yellow vest. As I was saying, there would be much more to say about the yellow vest, and also about the kind of continuity between the movement of the yellow vest and the great insurgent mobilization these days in France against the pension reform. But so to conclude, I will put it in a classical and maybe at first not so exciting way. Maybe we need to stress something that Ranabir himself touches upon in the book, which means the fact that populism is, as it was in its classical historical instances, both in Russia and in the US, a transition formation. And we should shift attention from populism as a form of manifestation of a set of questions to the return of class and class struggles that it announces. Not so exciting, kind of traditional Marxist point, it may seem, but believe me, this is not an old style call to reinstate some traditional image of the working class. The opposite is the case. Class today is a riddle, no less so than at the time of Marx, that toward the end of Capital Volume 3 stressed precisely the difficult to define class. Class today is crisscrossed by multifarious differences, and its unity cannot revolve neither analytically nor politically around a homogeneous section, as in many places, and for a quite long period of time, it happened with the industrial working class. The concept of multitude, at least in my use, registers precisely this composition of class today. once class is understood in terms, once populism is understood in terms of an ensemble of political and economic practices, as in Ranabir's book, then it can provide a lens for the investigation of this massive class composition. While as a discourse, at least in the European countries with which I am familiar, it stresses the absolute homogeneity of the people and ends up erasing the materiality of class. So thank you.
Thank you, Sandro, for your illuminating reflections on the book. I will now call upon the participants, the attendees as well, to raise questions, offer their comments, both on the book or maybe to the author and to the commentators here. You can turn on the audio and video and then can offer your questions, or you can post them on the chat box. So I see Mr. Joydev Kaur, he wants to say something. I will request him to say something on the book and the discussion that has taken place. Yes, go ahead.
Sir, namaste. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you. Just come to the point.
Sir, exactly. I'm doing research on partisan literature, sir. And sir, I want to know about that, Kolkata Research Group and an internship that Kolkata Research Group is providing for further research on partisan literature and Bengalis people that have been rehabilitated in Dandakaranya area, because I have spent 3 to 4 years there.
It's all right. It's all right. Just follow our website and you get to know what kind of research we do. We have a book, by the way, on Dandakaranya, and I will strongly recommend that you get hold of the book and read it. So if you have any query, just send your queries to our office and they will respond. Thank you very much. So anyone else? So there is a question which comes from Devaparna Roy. I don't know, it might be a comment, but let me read it out for you. I am awaiting my copy of Ranabir's book, Imprints, so that's a personal kind of thing. So this question may be relevant or not. I am interested in questions of social and economic development of Indian subnational units. Can you please tell me if contours of your definitive Mamata Banerjee / West Bengal model of development vis-a-vis the Gujarat model of development is emerging? I think that this question can be sort of rephrased in a way that do we see two different kinds of populism? In other words, I guess that she is alluding to the populism of Narendra Modi when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat and Mamata Banerjee. So that could be a good comparison. So this is a question for Ranabir. And there is another question. So I will request all of you to take note of the question so that you can respond to them. So there is a question from Manobika Mandal. This is on how can we distinguish populist politics in Assam versus in West Bengal with respect to porous borders. I think methodologically this question resonates with the earlier question because it is actually some sort of a cross-state comparison of different kinds of populism. You can actually, I think Sandro has reflected on populism in Latin America, populism in other places, and populism in Bengal as well. So does populism offer insights, theoretical insights, or whatever insights, if they are sort of framed in a comparative context? So this is a question which comes from Francis Adaikalan, also stretching in further on Dravidian model of development. I think a lot of questions actually has to do with this comparative framework, the relevance of a comparative framework in understanding populism. I think the methodological part of the question can also be addressed by Sandro, that how fruitful the comparative framework might be in understanding populism. Or are we talking about same populism? Or have we been talking about same populisms in a longer historical context? In fact, the last question is for Samita. And I would request her actually to sort of frame the comparative framework on a vertical time scale and to see if there is any significant variation in their manifestations. I think, so these are the questions basically. So let us have the first round and then we will take the second round of questions. But I would request the attendees and participants to sort of keep posting their comments before we begin the second round. So I will first sort of take the questions to Professor Samaddar and then to Sandro and finally to Samita.
I have, not much to comment on. Let me take the last thing about, comparison with Assam, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, etc., or globally. I do not know. I mean, my purpose was not to set up West Bengal as a model of, populist politics. So this is always the dilemma when you write of a deeply local experience, but you suggest that there is some general truth in it. So I would only confine myself to this remark that deep local studies can produce what may be called concrete universals. But whether this model exactly, is replicable in other states or in other countries, I think that would not be the right way to look at the things, because if you take Tamil Nadu, now, fact is that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Tamil Nadu, politics would not be discussed in the framework of populism. There are books on cinema and politics, I do not want to go into the studies that have been done on Tamil culture and Tamil politics, etc. But all I'm saying is that I go back to that, what is it in today's time that induces us, encourages us to review our political past through a view or through a lens which allows the interplay of people, population, citizen, alien, etc. And not so much in the hard categories that were commonplace in the studies, historical and political studies. Think of this great book about the rise of the Nadars as an important caste and political community in Tamil Nadu. One can go on with various studies. And if you take Tamil Nadu, again, very interesting that there is, a whole history of anti-Brahmin movement. There is the link between in some way, you may use the word Renaissance in the sense of finding out the lost history, revival of, some of the lost histories, lost cultural thing. At the same time, its combination with, extending greater and greater, protection coverage to large numbers of people. In essentials, you may find that on the whole, without taking a very hard authoritarian way of conducting politics, there are certain truths in the way in which, West Bengal or several other states have conducted their politics. And I go back, therefore, to the question of protection, welfare, etc. So it's not so much whether West Bengal, model is applicable. How do I compare? I don't think they are to be compared. But this brings me back to two things that, and I think Samita got me right. But I have a, Samita, it's not deliberately a clever answer, but it's a confession, which is that, I was experimenting with two things. Therefore, Samir, it's a confession to you also that I did not tell the full truth when I confessed what led me to writing the book. Two things. One is that, can you write a book on politics, which will be around elections, yet not writing on elections? So election is only the foil, and therefore, we are so engrossed. This is why I'm going back to the question of representation, our infatuation with politics as representational politics, that we often miss what is happening in front of our eyes, that what is happening in election is not simply who will be our leaders, who will be our, representatives in parliament, assemblies, and government, etc. It's something more. And therefore, when we speak of electoral power is not simply something that sets a government. The party which loses also amasses a huge, kind of power, and a power of a different type, a way to mobilize, etc. I mean, one can go on. So can you write of elections without writing of representative democracy, but writing of something different? Second is, in the same vein, can you write of women without, once again, indulging in, and Samita, this is where my confession is stark, since I'm very afraid of, I did not deliberately theorize on any of these things, because precisely, again, the challenge was, how do you write on women in politics without, taking recourse to the standard accounts of, many, many things. So this, in fact, leads me to the question of lexicon. And again, Samita, I think you have got absolutely, right on this. The migrant question is therefore important, because through the migrant question, you are quizzing the citizenship question. And that's where the importance of the last chapter is, that citizen vote, democracy, standard institutions of parliament, trade unions, registered associations, the legality of our democracy, and how much of this is germane to populist politics. Populist politics makes cynical use of all these institutions. But precisely that is where the whole question of punitive society comes, that on one hand, the aim of capital is to make the society punitive. Anyone who violates the standards of legality, the protocols of law, will be punished. And there is a particular way in which punishment will be visited upon. Punishment will be inflicted on. And on the other hand, the way people look at this whole, armature of democracy in the way they have seen it. So that is, something where the citizenship actually offers, if you inspect and closely examine the thing, you can see a large and a hugely messy scenario. One more comment, which is on the whole thing, that in terms of practices, a point that Sandro raises, can we not or should we not distinguish between the right-wing practices and the left-wing practices, etc.? I would say we would not, but again, I would not give much credence to that. Allow me for moments. Take, let us, for instance, the classic historical studies by Charles Tilly. Now, Tilly, precisely the age that he was studying, the 18th century, the 19th century. Now, and Tilly was saying that how people actually switched on from setting fire to an orderly way of demonstration, from torchlight procession to again something more. And this fascinating book about popular contentions in Britain and France of 100 or 200 years, 150 years, in fact. Now, these methods will be used both by right and the left. Revolution, this word, we are now used to this word being coined as lipstick revolution. There is orange revolution. No point in quarreling that these were not revolutions, those were real revolutions. Real revolutions, false revolutions, we do not go far with that. We have to rather accept that these modes of action can be used by both right and left. And this is the question of conjuncture. This is the time. This is precisely telling us of a set of circumstances which allows certain things to be, you may say, a kind of, it's a moment of contest where it may go this way, it may go that. And in a way, therefore, Carl Schmitt is right that the difference between, the left and the right, or the revolutionary left and the right, is not in that sense, the intrinsic merit of who will, but who really has a much more tactical sense of using the situation to one's advantage. And it is in that sense, populism is an anti-strategic politics to which Samir referred. Finally, I think there is one more point that where Sandro is right, that there is something going on in terms of global transition. There is something going on in countries facing the onslaught of neoliberalism. A great deal is a change, great deal of change is taking place in the composition of capital in as much as in the composition of labor. I would not, only the caution that I would suggest is that let us be a little wary of the word transition, because transition to what and transition from what, it's rather important to take the situation in its own merit. The situation is like this, where a large number of old concepts, old ideas will not work. Therefore, Sandro is right that I am ambivalent about this whole question of left-wing populism. On the one hand, I understand that populism represents a conjuncture. There is a question of populist movement. And therefore, it's a question of, how much significance it has in terms of social transformation. And on the other hand, not much use in saying these are left-wing populists, those are right-wing populists, because the moment we go into that, we are into the trap of liberal discourse, where Hungary is more authoritarian, more populist. And today in France, you find that what doesn't happen in India also, in spite of it, say that the president or the prime minister says that this law will not be put into vote, but the law is enacted. As you know, in France, 2 nights before, it happened that the pension law came in force. While, because the government knew that the government would not be able to pass the thing. So what is democratic, what is not, unless we are to, again, trapped by the liberal discourse. We must understand in that sense, Samir, for once, allow me to put a French word, the French name, which I was avoiding except Foucault, but Foucault is French in as much as he's European. But which is, Rosenvalens has a set of fascinating essays. It is called Counter-Democracy. And his main thesis is that democracy begins by producing its countermeasures. And those countermeasures are as much a part of democracy as the so-called democracy. So therefore, I have put a question in the book, when has democracy been without its populist component. When has the story of people been written without the story of the populist uprising, populist interventions that have always interrogated the representative story of democracy? That's all.
Thank you. Sandro?
Yes, first of all, let me say that what Ranabir was saying about the pension reform in France is particularly important. It says something about the state of democracy in France, but more generally in Europe, in the West. The reform was forced without a parliamentary vote in a situation in which all polls say that 70% of the French population oppose that reform. So I think this is a point we have to keep in mind while talking about democratic popular politics today in Europe and beyond Europe, because as Ranabir was saying, there are similar instances also in India and elsewhere in the world. A couple of words on the question of development, that is indeed a very important question, of course, but also interesting in the connection with populism. Ranabir has very interesting pages on this question when he discusses West Bengali populist economics. And the point that in a way struck me while reading is the opposition between populist economics and the developed model promoted by the left front that was predicated on land acquisition in order to spur industrialization for export. Nandigram 2007 is relevant here, I think. So, of course, I would like to hear more, but maybe not today, about this kind of populist model of development in West Bengal, and about the ways, as I was saying before, in which, let's say, capital negotiates this model of development. But speaking of comparison, of course, Latin America is a very important reference. Over the last 20 years, we had several left governments that were often deemed as populist in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and also in other countries. In the book, Ranabir discusses Venezuela, and Venezuela is a kind of difficult instance, you know, because if you look at the development model, it is completely based on oil. So that many critics have contended that Venezuela continues to be a specific instance of petrocapitalism. And in Venezuela, over the last 10 years, there is a word that has circulated a lot, which is Boliborgesia. a bourgeoisie, a Bolivarian bourgeoisie, reproducing itself around the cycle of oil extraction. And this was the case even in the years of Chavez. But Chavez was always, at least rhetorically, stressing the need to go beyond this model. In the very difficult situation of the last 10 to 15 years, no attempt has been made to go beyond a model centered upon the extraction of oil. And I don't think this is a very interesting alternative model of development. More generally, at the regional scale, the notion of neo-extractivism has been used a lot over the last 2 decades by left critics of the so-called new progressive governments. So in many places, there is no time now for the details, of course, but in many places, the so-called progressive governments have spurred the processes of further entrenchment of extractive activities, of the extractive activities that have been crucial to the integration of the region in the world market, at least since the 16th century. Entrenchment of extractive activities has meant also a surge in the extractive rent. And many governments have used the extractive rent in order to fund social policies, in order to fight poverty, with more or less success depending on the country. But in general, all these governments have always presented extraction as a cornerstone of a first phase of government, saying that what was needed in a second phase was a kind of diversification of economic activities, a kind of diversification of the development model. In a way, you know, it never really happened. So I'm not completely critical. I'm aware of the fact that the conjuncture has been particularly difficult over the last years. The political conjunction, the economic conjunction, the global conjunction. These governments emerged in the first decade of the 21st century when they could exploit a commodity boom in global financial markets. And this is the reason why they were quite successful at the beginning in collecting the extractive rent. But then the situation changed in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and everything became more difficult. But I would say that there are even now governments that are aware of the need to go beyond, let's say, this first phase of a progressive politics. In Colombia, for instance, even in Brazil, in Bolivia. You know. So the question that remains, and I conclude, is whether the definition of these governments as populist have helped them to imagine ways to go beyond extractivism or not. we have mentioned of a couple of times, both myself and Ranabir, Ernesto Laclau. Ernesto Laclau was Argentinian, and he has been very, very influential among the Latin American progressive governments. I do not know. I think that populism in Latin America in these years has worked more as a legitimizing discourse, a legitimizing rhetoric than a material political constellation. Needless to say, I mean, we would need more time to go into the details. But let me conclude by saying, always thinking of Latin America, that today we are confronted in several countries of the region with the rise of a new right that also seems to kind of replicate traditional forms of populist politics. You know, this happens, of course, in Brazil. We are all aware of that, but also in other countries, like, for instance, Bolivia and Argentina. So again, I am aware of the fact that the notion of populism, particularly in the way in which Ranabir understands it, can be a productive analytical tool. I'm not sure whether it works politically, you know, but that's an open question, of course.
Thank you, Sandro. That was really an impossible task. I mean, thinking of Latin America in just a few minutes. I will now request Samita Sen to respond. Samita, will you allow me to sort of draw your attention to one of the questions which has been posted on the chat box so that you can actually respond to these questions in one go? This is a question which comes from, I think this is a question which comes from Jishnu Dasgupta. While I agree with your general argument about Mamta and the gendered constituency, I can't quite see eye to eye on populism taking along the whole people, even in theory, as you mentioned in passing. Populism also defines itself in terms of who it excludes from the populism. No, I think I lost the track. Populism also defines its excludes from the people it claims to represent, does it not? In other words, you know that there's a fundamental methodological disagreement on what is. So, and then you know that the same person, Jishnu, actually says that, or maybe I just misheard you due to poor.
Yes, Samir, you're frozen, so I'm going to jump in. And I will connect Jishnu's question to some of the other questions that you had posed earlier. So Jishnu, yeah, I mean, I don't think you misheard me, but it was I made the point very quickly. What I was referring to is that, as Sandro was saying, in the discourse on populism, the rhetoric of populism, it is the classic view is that usually you don't use categories within, you don't break up people in categories, you address the people. The people is your category, and that is what you address. But of course, even in classical populist rhetoric, that is not always true. Like in this book, Ranabir, when he spoke, there is agrarian populism, which addresses the peasant. There are sometimes specific forms of populism which address specific categories of the people. However, it is interesting to pose the question at this point in time. So I was only referring to the fact that Mamata Banerjee is addressing the constituency of women while denying that she does so. So that is an interesting tension in her approach to the question. But in today's context, this is an even more interesting issue for us in India because of Modi's populism, which is very clearly not about the people, which is about only the Hindu people. So there is an exclusion built into it. But nevertheless, your general point that populism, whatever its rhetoric, always has exclusion is extremely well taken. I have no quarrel with that argument. Now, moving from this to the questions on development that were posed earlier in the chat, I would be, though in this book, Ranabir connects populism with a particular form of development that the TMC government in West Bengal has adopted, and he has a very interesting chapter on that in the book. I would be cautious about conflating populism and development. I wouldn't say all models of development are necessarily populist. I would argue that the Gujarat model of development is nothing to do with populism at all. Exactly. And though the Dravidian model of development does from time to time have populist governments, as in the case of Tamil Nadu and Jayalalitha, I don't think that model itself is populist, actually. So I would be cautious about comparisons posed to models of development and conflations with political arrangements around them. But taking some of these questions further, Sandro's proposal to address the question of transition, Ranabir's question about class, and the overall debate about development that is ongoing at the moment. This is something I've spoken of before, and I would draw your attention to again. And today, this issue has become an even more urgent discussion because of the floating of ChatGPT, which is going to replicate itself by hundreds very soon. Many more softwares are in the market, coming to the market in trial, etc. And I would suggest that one key transition of our time is in fact a complete change in class, in our understanding of class. Because the AI and the way this fourth industrial revolution, as we are calling it, targets not the traditional working class, but in fact the middle class. We are the artisans of the fourth industrial revolution. And it is precisely middle class jobs that are on the brink of being industrialized. Now, why I would connect this to Ranabir's the book under discussion is because of a particular puzzle that's kind of comes and goes in the book, but is not, I don't think, very explicitly posed, which is, and in Bengal's context, of course, you can't talk of the left because there are many lefts. And of course, the left that we most often speak of is what I would call the establishment left. And today in Bengal, as indeed in many other countries, and I'm particularly reminded of this because I am in the UK at the moment, and this is as true of the Labour Party in the UK as it is of the establishment left in West Bengal, that the left advocacy is primarily of middle class. It is, so the working class is voting for Conservative Party in UK, for Trinamool Congress in West Bengal, and it is the middle class who have become associated with certainly establishment left politics. And I would connect this change in political, social alliance to, in fact, the stage and capital and the transformations in the stage and capital that we are in today. So questions of development cannot actually, I think, be posed without reference to this very rapidly changing contours of social conflict that we are within today. Samir, there is one more question here. I think it's posed to Ranabir, but I would just want to say one word in response to that.
Please go ahead.
The question is from a Facebook attendee. The question is, if Professor Samaddar agrees that Mamata Banerjee was the first politician to think of women as a constituency, then why is there such a disquiet among the members of the feminist movement to consider her a feminist, especially among middle-class feminists? I would briefly caution that there is not one feminist movement. There are many feminist movements in India, in West Bengal too. And not all middle-class feminists are disquieted by Mamata Banerjee. But just two things. One is that Mamata Banerjee may not be the first to think of women as constituency. Women as constituency, it is a time, I think. It is an idea whose time has come. And many people are now thinking of it. Mamata Banerjee is perhaps one of the most successful politicians who stitched a women's constituency together. But there is no question that Mamata Banerjee is the first successful woman leader to come to power in any capacity at a state or national level, who has forged her own path. She does not come the traditional way in which women have come to power in South Asia. And it is very, very remarkable that South Asia, it stands out in the world. The world is coming to it now. Today we see women in positions of power across the world. South Asia did this a generation ago in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India. In every country in South Asia, you have had women in power. And that is not because women are socially or politically empowered, but because of the importance of the family. It is the family which allowed women to come to power. Mamata has broken that trend. She is the only woman who has made her, as an individual, made her way into politics rather than as a wife or mistress or daughter or in some familiar kinship relation. And that is recognized, I think. Many middle-class feminists who have other political alliances don't want to see it, don't want to give her that due. That's my response.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that my chat box has gone blank, so I can't see if there is any question or comment which is being posted. So I would ask Rajat to check if there is any more question on the chat box. Rajat, is there any more question on the chat box? No. Thank you, Sandro. Ranabir, do you want to have any final comment, or should we then?
No, I mean, nothing really. I appreciate particularly Samita's observation on the last, the last part that he said. I will only say that, something that probably did not come up in the discussion, but that there was in the book, but I think it should have been, explained at length. What is it that allows Mamata to build and expand that constituency? And was it a pure tactical ploy that before 2011, that famous interview which Samita referred to, where she said that I have brothers, I have not, it's not a feminist politics that I'm going to do, etc. And yet she does it. Is it simply a cynical use, or what is it that, allows her? And that is where apart from Samita's explanation about the family, kinship, the way, I think there is one very important thing which populist politics allows. And it connects with that chapter on economics. And I said in that chapter, I still remember, which is that we have a history of economic thought, but that history of economic thought doesn't tell us that the way a parallel concept of justice has interrogated that established history of economic thought. And I refer to that, and I say that from the earliest time, whether you think of established economic thought or you think of the way economic thought has developed in India, for example. Imon has done his PhD on that. There is a book, probably not edited by Dipesh, but Dipesh has a chapter on the specifics of non-mainstream economic thinking, etc., where justice plays a very important role in shaping economic ideas, and where the idea of justice critiques continuously some of the rational explanations in it. I wouldn't like to go into that, but I think what I wanted to say in that chapter, which connects me to what Samir was saying, that in Mamata, in several other, think of Telangana today, which has outdone many of the states in India in terms of indices of human development. In education, like Tamil Nadu was at one point of time held up as probably the most progressive example, etc. And there you will see that the populist idea of what is justice, how do you ensure justice for the people? The populists will not deny that there is an economic logic. The populists will not deny that there is capital. The populists will not deny that there is extraction. Think of sand mining in West Bengal, the continuous attempt by the West Bengal government to control it, and the ineradicable reality that nobody can control sand mining. The way it happens, that way it affects politics, binds politics in its way, etc. So if all these go on, then how does a populist government protect people? So the idea of protection, the idea of care, these are the two words that shape the idea of justice in modern subaltern politics as opposed to neoliberalism. That is a very important point. And the moment you think of how do you protect people, particularly in the whole Corona crisis, you will see that this is where more and more the populist government will be driven to what is considered as women-centric, policies. And if any government, Mamata today may not be in power, but any government comes to power in West Bengal, not a TMC government, that government will have to think 100 times if it wants to withdraw any of the welfare measures introduced by Mamata. Precisely because this is West Bengal, this is not France. I asked somebody in France, why is it that non-working class people support the agitation against, the pension reform? Simply because that is one of the principal forms of the French welfare state. The idea of pension affects not only the working class, the idea of pension affects everyone. In the factory, in the shop, in government offices, everyone. Similarly, today, whether it is Lokhir Bhandar or it is public distribution system, PDS, there are certain accepted things. People have now come to accept these are our rights. If there is a government, that government has to redeem its legitimacy precisely by maintaining things that we think to be ours, in as much as pension is considered that in France. So today, there is not really much paradoxical or not really much contradictory in Mamata's attitude. She will always say, I am universal. Who says that I'm only pro-women in particular? The more she wants to be universal, the more she will, bend towards and figure out what could be the special schemes for women, for children, etc., etc. So I don't want to go into that, but I think the question of justice as it is being shaped today under neoliberal conditions is something that, I think future historians will give really importance to these things, exactly as Christopher Hill thought of writing of 17th century and saying that, look, this was the world turned upside down, old biblical saying. But that is the way he interpreted the 17th century British history or English history, what it is.
Thank you, Ranabir. We take it as a wrap-up comment, but if I may sort of briefly sum up the discussion. At one place, Ranabir describes populism as a style, but my takeaway from the discussion is that if it's a style, then it has the power of restyling many other things like class, gender, democracy, justice, economy, so on and so forth. So if it's a style that has the power of restyling so many things, is it a mere style? I will ask Ranabir. Or is it not an episteme? I think that is the forte for another seminar. I thank you, Ranabir. Congratulations. And I thank particularly Samita Sen and Sandro Mezzadra for their insightful comments. I enjoyed the debate. It was a great learning experience for me. I also thank my colleagues at CRG and also others who had posed interesting questions which made our discussion very, very exciting. Thank you very much.